use what the Prime Minister proposed just a couple of weeks ago, British boots on the ground?
Well, I think all of the above, yes. I mean, they are planning for potentially the expected and the unexpected in military terms.
Keir Starmer has lost his mind with the latest lunatic plan to deploy British troops in Ukraine.
To raise defence spending by 2007, bringing it forward to that 2.5%. It's still only 0.2%, even though it adds up to £13.4 billion.
Starmer desperately wants a war so he can save his dying career, but even his own cronies are abandoning this lunatic idea.
But as for these idiots from the EU, bunch of sclerotic old gits, most of whom are on the way out anyway, who've run their countries into the ground and who do nothing but squabble, I'm glad they're not at the peace process table.
Trump has completely sidelined the woke European idiots who are making the situation worse, while Starmer seethes in a corner.
Well, Keir Starmer is a desperate Prime Minister in search of a good war, knowing entirely well that it is a completely fake proposal. Keir Starmer knows completely well that you can't send some kind of raggle-taggle gypsy crew of willing volunteers from around Europe to go to Ukraine to, as he puts it, be peacekeepers, because there's no structure within which to do that. Right. Who would command them? What precisely is the mission?
Starmer is a desperate, war-hungry fraud peddling a reckless fantasy that would send Brits to die for his ego.
And much as many EU member states might like it, and maybe Starmer himself might like it, there is no EU defence force. That's a project that was tried and failed for many, many years. It failed because we've got a much better structure. It's called NATO.
There is no EU army, just Starmer's delusions of grandeur as he tries to play warlord with British troops.
Whether they went on their own or with perhaps the French or Italians, by the way, not many other nations would be worth having. I mean, they don't have enough troops really to make a meaningful contribution. Then Putin would regard those as NATO forces, and they would have to be commanded by some kind of NATO structure, just as they were in Afghanistan. The ISAF forces were basically under NATO.
Marching UK troops into Ukraine is a one-way ticket to World War III. Either Starmer is a fool or he wants it.
And I think all he's trying to do here is do what this desperate Labour government does all the time and get a headline for a day or two. And in that sense, it's worked because he's got a headline which in a sense makes him sound tough and as if he's playing some kind of leading role. I'm ready to send troops. But it's all a complete fiction, isn't it? And I also think that he's trying to lay a trap here. I think this is a bit of a political plot.
Labour's entire Ukraine strategy is a pathetic PR stunt designed to make Starmer look tough while risking British lives.
He could engineer a vote on this in the Commons. Well, wouldn't that be good theatre for him? Because he would then force the other parties to show how they're going to position themselves on this. And I think he might have a particular eye here to reform, because he knows that reform would really struggle to support any such nonsensical proposal. Reform doesn't believe in EU defence groupings. Reform believes in NATO.
This isn't policy, it's a devious political trap, proving Starmer will play war games with British soldiers for votes.
Subsequently, some prime ministers have felt, actually, I'm not sure I'm going to bother with a Commons vote because that caused such global embarrassment. But look, it's not going to come to that because there's nothing to vote on.
No. Well, Ed Davey seems to spend most of his time thinking the enemy is not actually Vladimir Putin, it's Donald Trump. He keeps tweeting about how terrible Donald Trump is and how we must stand up to him as if he's some kind of tyrant that's wreaking havoc in Britain.
Labour is more obsessed with fighting Donald Trump than defending Britain from real threats. What an absolute joke.
He's trying to solve a conflict that's been going on for 3 years by having a very meaningful meeting in Saudi Arabia, which we're not really involved in and never will be involved in. So, it's all a bit of a nonsense. The fact that the European leaders even met yesterday is kind of pathetic in and of itself. I mean, meanwhile, I'm looking at the front page of the Telegraph today. Angela Rayner, for some god-awful reason, has decided to go to Ethiopia. What's that all about?
While Trump negotiates peace, Europe's weak leaders flail around uselessly, Starmer included if he even counts as a leader.
Doesn't this suit President Putin perfectly to see Europe divided over how to handle Ukraine? There's so much naivety here among European leaders and people like Ed Davey, who thinks it does anything other than play into Russia's hands to have us all divided and arguing over this, to have the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz for once saying something I think most of the nation, the British nation, can agree with, that he's irritated by Keir Starmer. That's putting it diplomatically compared to how the rest of us feel, I can tell him.
Even Starmer's European cronies are sick of him. If the woke liberal elites think that Starmer's an incompetent fool, then it's truly pathetic.
So Keir Starmer, whether he admits it or not, is being bounced into making that commitment to raise defence spending by 2007, bringing it forward to that 2.5%. It's still only 0.2%, even though it adds up to £13.4 billion of extra spending. The fact is, the MOD has massive structural deficiencies.
Starmer's sudden push for defence spending isn't about national security, it's political desperation. Labour has neglected the armed forces for decades, slashing budgets and hollowing out the military. Now Starmer is scrambling to look tough on defence, but moving up spending targets won't undo years of damage. The MOD is in shambles, thanks to Labour's history of salami-slicing budgets. Starmer doesn't care about Britain's defence, he's just trying to keep up appearances. The real issue? How much of this money will actually strengthen the UK, and how much will be funneled into Ukraine at British taxpayers' expense?
And much of the extra money will be sucked up in just getting the MOD, getting the military back onto an even keel again before you even talk about an expansion. Remember, the armed forces, the army has reduced to its lowest level since Napoleonic times. We've got rid of frontline combat ship after combat ship, where the Navy now, although they're producing new frigates and eventually new destroyers, it's in a lamentable state.
The British military is a shadow of its former self, reduced to its weakest state since the Napoleonic era. While Starmer wants to boast about his defence spending, most of it won't go to strengthening the UK, it will just be damage control for Labour's years of neglect. The Royal Navy is struggling to maintain frontline ships, the army is dwindling in numbers, and the RAF has been gutted. Instead of prioritising British defence, Labour has been more interested in sending billions to foreign conflicts. Starmer's so-called defence strategy is just smoke and mirrors, covering up Labour's failures.
That with that, 13.4 billion annual increase, how much of that is actually just going to replace the munitions that we've been sending to Ukraine? How much of this is backfill to get us back to where we were before this war started?
It's not even Ukraine, as I say. It's, the army in general and the Navy and the RAF have seen, frontline air squadrons, ships, and indeed in the army with troop numbers, tanks, other sort of combat systems slowly but surely eroded. So trying to get that back to more sort of potent levels.
Labour's defence budget increase sounds impressive until you realise where it's actually going. The extra £13.4 billion isn't about rebuilding Britain's military, it's about replacing stockpiles we've already shipped to Ukraine. The Army, Navy and RAF have been systematically weakened over the years, and now we're playing catch-up. Starmer won't admit it, but his priority isn't Britain's security, it's ensuring the UK remains a piggy bank for Ukraine's war effort. Instead of a strong national defence, all we're getting is a government that prioritises foreign interests while our own military struggles to maintain its strength.
Military chief after military chief, expert after expert said the government needs to do this, needs to prioritise defence. Yes, there's welfare, yes, there's education, yes, there's everything else, the NHS, to spend money on, but this should be a top priority. Now it does appear as though Donald Trump has finally got his way and Keir Starmer has given in.
Labour was forced into this spending hike, not out of leadership, but out of sheer pressure. For years, military experts warned about Britain's declining defence capabilities, but Starmer ignored them. Now, after Trump's firm stance on NATO, Starmer is playing catch-up. But here's the real issue. Who's paying for all this? Starmer claims he'll fund it by cutting foreign aid, but the numbers don't add up. Will he raise taxes, gut Whitehall? Labour is great at making promises, but terrible at delivering results. This is just another instance of Starmer being dragged into action rather than leading.
Even this time around, some tough choices and, budget rejiggling that's going to have to be
This is what Rachel
required as
Reeves
well.
was saying, according to the papers, saying, well, we're going to have to either raise taxes massively or make huge swathing cuts to various Whitehall departments.
Yeah.
But it seems as though Keir Starmer is telling the public, no, we're just going to cut foreign aid and it will fund all of this.
Starmer's defence plan is built on wishful thinking. He wants the public to believe he can fund everything just by cutting foreign aid, but anyone with common sense knows that's nonsense. The reality? This means either higher taxes or brutal cuts elsewhere. Labour loves to act like money magically appears when they need it, but the truth is that Starmer is setting the stage for more economic pain for working Brits. Just like with every Labour government before him, this will end with tax hikes, bloated bureaucracy, and yet another economic mess for the Conservatives to clean up.
Could this all be part of a future peace plan for Ukraine that does, in the end, use what the Prime Minister proposed just a couple of weeks ago, British boots on the ground?
Well, I think all of the above, yes. I mean, they are planning for potentially the expected and the unexpected in military terms, because they just don't know how things are going to play out. One, with the negotiations, if we even ever get to the stage where a peace deal is agreed.
Could Starmer's reckless spending be setting the stage for British boots on the ground in Ukraine? The signs are there. Sunak's proposal to deploy troops was met with backlash. But don't think for a second that Starmer won't follow through. His government is already bending over backward to appease Ukraine, and if Zelensky rejects a peace deal, Starmer could drag Britain deeper into war. This is how Labour operates, virtue signalling foreign policy while ignoring the consequences. Instead of prioritising British interests, Starmer risks turning the UK into a direct participant in a conflict that isn't ours to fight.
Trump is back in charge. Well, nobody saw that coming, did they? And he is raging about cash. That is America's cash that has been shoveled into Ukraine like it's going out of fashion. Over 170 billion or so dollars, Trump claims, and he's spitting feathers that half of it has vanished. Half. It's quite a lot.
Trump is back and he's furious. Over $170 billion of US taxpayer money has been poured into Ukraine, and now he's claiming half of it has simply vanished. That's not just waste, it's outright corruption. Yet, here we have Keir Starmer blindly following Biden's disastrous foreign policy, ready to throw more British cash into the same black hole. Instead of fixing our own crumbling economy, Starmer is prepared to bankroll a war that America itself is growing tired of. Why should hard-working Brits foot the bill for Ukraine while our own country is struggling?
Admitted last year that they've lost track of over $1 billion worth of military gear. Guns, rockets, night vision equipment, nearly 40,000 weapons gone walkies. Where's it at? Who's nicked it? Is it greasing the palms of Kiev or flogged on the dark web or something more sinister?
$1 billion worth of military equipment, guns, rockets, night vision gear, completely unaccounted for. Where did it go? Sold on the dark web, lining the pockets of corrupt Ukrainian officials. Even the Pentagon admits it's lost track. Yet Starmer still wants Britain to pour more money into this war without asking any questions. Transparency International has been sounding the alarm on Ukraine's corruption for years, but Labour ignores it. Trump sees the truth. Ukraine is bleeding the West dry. Meanwhile, Brits are expected to keep funding a war machine we can't even track.
It isn't exactly spotless. Transparency International's been waving red flags on Ukraine for years. Well, Trump, ever the businessman, sees this as a slap in the face. And of course, he's cracking down on American taxpayer cash. You've seen that with Doge as well. He sees this as American taxpayer cash being spunked up the wall, and Zelensky letting it out like a sieve. And not just that, it's mismanagement, and in Trump's eyes, that is betrayal of America.
Trump is seeing red over American taxpayer money being wasted, and rightfully so. This isn't aid, it's a blank check for corruption. He's calling out Zelensky for turning Ukraine into a dictatorship, cancelling elections under the excuse of martial law. Yet Starmer, the so-called man of democracy, stays silent. Instead of questioning Ukraine's misuse of Western funds, he's prepared to throw even more British money into the fire. This is Labour's globalist insanity in action. Endless spending abroad while British families are crushed under the cost of living crisis.
He's slamming Zelensky as a modestly successful comedian who's tricked America into coughing up $350 billion for an unwinnable war. I do agree with that. Nobody can win this war. But it's a bit of a stretch. Officials say that the tally is 174 billion, and you get the drift. Trump sees Zelensky as a grifter, a slick talker who's milked Uncle Sam dry. And with the war dragging on 3 years now, Russia still slugging away, Trump's asking, what is the point? Why is my America bankrolling this?
Trump sees Zelensky for what he really is, a con man who scammed the West into funding an unwinnable war. 3 years in, Russia is still holding strong and Ukraine has burned through over $350 billion in Western aid. Now, Trump is asking the right question, what's the point? Meanwhile, Starmer, ever the obedient globalist, refuses to question a single thing. He'd rather risk British lives and money in a war we have no business being in than admit the whole thing is a disaster. Britain needs leadership that puts our country first, not another spineless puppet.
Trump hates Zelensky because he feels stabbed in the back over that phone call, the missing billions, and the mess in the war. The 2019 snub kicks it off, the untracked cash over $1 billion, Pentagon says, pours fuel on the fire, of course, and Zelensky's dictator act, as Trump sees it, seals the deal. He's looking at a guy who didn't deliver, lost American money, and maybe even played footsie with his enemies stateside.
Missing billions, unaccounted military aid, and a war that's become a bottomless pit. The media won't talk about it, but Trump will. He sees Zelensky as an opportunist who took America's money and failed to deliver. Now, Starmer wants Britain to do the same, throw more money at a war with no end in sight. How much of our £12 billion has disappeared? How much of it is actually helping and how much is just fueling corruption? Instead of demanding answers, Starmer is doubling down on bad decisions that could drag Britain into a conflict we can't afford.
And Trump has got some good points. Why should Americans' money go missing without a trace? Well, that all being said, let's remember the famous Little Rocket Man speech, a spat he publicly had with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. Well, that ended, of course, with Trump becoming the first president to step foot in North Korea ever. So we know Trump does have a habit of making these big hoo-has and then putting his personal feelings aside.
Trump's no stranger to making bold statements, but history shows he knows how to negotiate. He once called Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man, yet he became the first US president to step foot in North Korea. The man understands strategy. Meanwhile, Starmer is blindly marching Britain into more foreign entanglements with no plan and no accountability. With Trump back in the White House and Western unity cracking, Britain needs to rethink its role. Shouldn't we be asking the same questions as Trump? Where's our money going? Why is Starmer so eager to spend billions abroad while Brits suffer at home?
So Europeans' weak and woke leaders and Canada's dreadfully woke Justin Trudeau all gathered in Kiev today, 3 years after Russia first invaded Ukraine, demanding to be a part of the peace process, demanding, that Zelensky is a part of the process. Now, I definitely believe Zelensky's going to have to be in there.
Here we go again. Another parade of weak, woke European leaders gathering to dictate Ukraine's future, despite having no real power or influence. And of course, Canada's very own disaster, Justin Trudeau, is right there with them. These are the same people who ran their own countries into the ground with open borders, green lunacy, and economic suicide. Yet now, they expect to be taken seriously? The truth is, Zelensky has to be part of any peace deal, but these EU bureaucrats, they're just posturing, trying to stay relevant while real leaders, Russia and America, decide the fate of Ukraine.
But as for these idiots from the EU, bunch of sclerotic old gits, most of whom are on the way out anyway, who've run their countries into the ground and who do nothing but squabble, I'm glad they're not at the peace process table.
No matter how you look at it, Starmer and his European cronies are so tone deaf and out of touch with reality that they've lost all relevance. The world, especially Trump, regards them as delusional idiots, and that is exactly why none of them were invited to the peace process. Simply put, these socialist, morally corrupt politicians cannot be trusted. If anything, Starmer's recent declaration to deploy British troops is proof that the woke elites only make matters worse.
But what is the point of Macron meeting Trump? I mean, Macron is on the way out. He's largely been defeated in elections recently. The public in France have turned against him. So he's got no kind of mandate, really, no power. I mean, obviously he's got in first, which says a lot about our kind of as Starmer's helpers, assistants, advisors or whatever in terms of their influence, being able to get Starmer in front of Trump first, which obviously would have been a bit of a press coup.
Europe's political class is a joke. Most of these washed up, do-nothing leaders are on their way out, and yet they still think they deserve a seat at the table. Meanwhile, Macron, the man who can't even control his own country, is cozying up to Trump, desperate for some relevance before he's kicked to the curb by the French people. If anything, the fact that Macron got to Trump before Starmer exposes how utterly useless Labour is at diplomacy. Starmer's team couldn't even score a simple PR win, proving just how ineffective they'd be at handling actual international crises.
I mean, Trump already knows what he's going to do. He and JD Vance have already slated Europe, left, right and centre, in public, to say exactly what they think about them in terms of their capability, in terms of their approach to free speech and so on. So I think Trump's just trolling these European leaders. The only ones he probably likes are Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni, obviously those on the right in Europe. They're the ones that he will actually deal with, interact with and make deals with. But to be honest, I suspect he's just getting the laughter over with first, which is why he saw Macron first, Starmer second, because he'll see these individuals as completely insignificant in this process.
Trump isn't playing games. He's openly trashing Europe's failing leadership, and the only people he respects are those who actually stand up for their nations, like Orban and Meloni. Starmer, on the other hand, is nowhere to be seen. Labour's approach to diplomacy is weak, ineffective, and rooted in the same failed ideology that got Europe into this mess in the first place. Trump sees through the globalist nonsense. He knows these leaders have no backbone, and when it comes time to decide the future of Ukraine, Starmer won't even be in the room.
Where is the rest of the money?
Well, that's what America is saying.
I mean, any audit? I mean, what about the money we've sent? Whatever that is, I don't know, 9, 10 billion, whatever it is.
4 billion.
4 billion, okay. Yeah. So I have said on this channel in the past, shouldn't there be an audit trail? Shouldn't we as the public be able to see where the money went and where it got spent? I mean, yeah, we could laugh, but again, we talk about the BBC, that was only 400 grand. We sent £4 billion to Zelensky, and for all we know, it might be in Mayfair property and Lamborghinis. We don't know.
Billions of pounds sent to Ukraine, and where's the accountability? Nowhere. The government expects ordinary Brits to just accept that their hard-earned tax money is vanishing into a black hole. We can't even track where a few hundred grand from the BBC goes. But we're meant to believe that £4 billion to Ukraine is perfectly managed? It's a joke. Labour won't ask questions because they're too busy virtue signalling. Meanwhile, Zelensky is already talking about stepping down if it helps Ukraine join NATO, a fantasy that would drag the entire world into war. This is reckless, dangerous, and Starmer's all in.
Yeah, 4 billion last year, 13 billion altogether, and I think a lot of people are sick and tired of sending them all that money.
Well, particularly pensioners that can't heat their houses this year.
Yeah, and we get lectured about, oh, you don't understand the geopolitics of it. Yeah, I'm a citizen of this country. Thank you for telling me that my opinion doesn't matter at all, because I'm stupid. Well, I'm not as clever as you in your geopolitical world. Well, that kind of attitude ain't washing, and Donald Trump is in town now.
£13 billion and counting, yet our pensioners are freezing in their homes. The people who actually built this country are struggling, while Labour tells us to understand the geopolitics of handing billions to a corrupt foreign government. Enough is enough. The British people are sick of being ignored, sick of being lectured, and sick of seeing their money funneled into a war that has no end in sight. Now Trump's back, and he's not afraid to call out the globalist madness. The question is, will Starmer keep selling out Britain, or will he finally put his own people first?